Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the coal mining regions of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The first Sunday of November 1923 began like any other in the small mining town of Beckley Hollow, nestled deep in the coal-rich valleys of Raleigh County, West Virginia. The autumn air carried the perpetual scent of coal dust and wood smoke from the company houses that lined the narrow valley like weathered teeth. Morning fog clung to the mountainsides, creating an atmosphere of isolation that seemed to press down on the settlement like a heavy blanket. It was on this particular Sunday that Cordelia Thane began what would become known locally as her Sunday soup tradition, a weekly offering of free hot meals to the hard-working miners and their families who attended morning service at the modest wooden chapel that served the community. The chapel itself was a simple structure built from local timber in 1919 when the Mountaineer Coal Company established operations in the valley. Its whitewashed walls had already begun to show the effects of coal dust, giving the building a perpetually grayish appearance that matched the complexion of the men who worked underground. The bell tower, barely tall enough to clear the surrounding hills, housed a brass bell donated by the coal company's Philadelphia headquarters. On Sunday mornings, its toll echoed through the valley, calling the faithful to worship and, unknowingly, to something far more sinister. According to church records maintained by the Beckley Hollow Historical Society and later transferred to the West Virginia State Archives, Mrs. Thane first approached Reverend Josiah Merkel with her proposal on October 28, 1923. The meeting took place in the Reverend's small office behind the altar, a cramped space that doubled as a storage room for hymnals and communion supplies. Reverend Merkel noted in his personal journal, discovered years later during the demolition of the old rectory in 1954, that the widow seemed genuinely concerned about the welfare of the mining families, particularly during the harsh winter months when work was sporadic and food scarce. Mrs. Thane had presented her proposal with the methodical precision that would later characterize her more horrific endeavors. She had researched the community's needs thoroughly, speaking with several miners' wives about their struggles to feed their families during periods when the mine was shut down due to weather or mechanical problems. She had calculated the cost of providing weekly meals for the entire congregation and assured the Reverend that her late husband's modest inheritance would more than cover the expenses. Her late husband, Ambrose Thane, had perished in a mine collapse 18 months prior, leaving her with a comfortable inheritance and a large empty house at the end of Copper Street. The arrangement was simple, almost elegant in its apparent generosity. Every Sunday after morning service, Mrs. Thane would provide large pots of hearty soup, fresh bread, and occasional desserts for anyone in need. The meals were served in the church basement, which had been converted into a modest social hall, complete with long wooden tables and benches that the men had built during their off hours. The cost was nothing more than a brief blessing and grateful thanks. For a community where company store credit often ran thin and winter hunger was a constant threat, this generosity seemed like an answer to prayers that many had been afraid to voice. Cordelia Thane was 57 years old at the time, a woman of medium height with prematurely gray hair that she kept pulled back in a severe bun secured with pins that had belonged to her mother. Those who knew her described her as quiet, methodical, and somewhat distant since her husband's death, though they attributed this withdrawal to the natural grief of a woman who had lost her companion after 28 years of marriage. She had moved to Beckley Hollow in 1919 when Ambrose took a position as a shift supervisor at the Mountaineer Coal Company, bringing with him years of experience from the Pennsylvania coal fields and a reputation for fairness that made him popular among the workers. The couple had lived in mining communities throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, before settling in West Virginia, never remaining in any location for more than 3 or 4 years. This pattern of frequent relocation was common among mining families, as companies often transferred experienced personnel to new operations or as economic conditions forced workers to seek employment elsewhere. The Thanes had no surviving relatives in the immediate area, a circumstance that had deepened Mrs. Thane's isolation after becoming a widow and made her gesture of community charity all the more touching to those who benefited from it. Their house, a 2-story frame structure with a large kitchen and extensive root cellar, sat apart from the company-owned residences on a plot of land that Ambrose had purchased outright, with money saved from his previous work in the Pennsylvania coal fields. The house was painted white with green shutters, features that distinguished it from the uniform gray of the company housing and marked the Thanes as people of slightly higher social and economic standing within the community hierarchy. The property included a substantial garden area, a small barn that housed Mrs. Thane's chickens and a milk cow, and a well that provided the household's water supply. The house's interior reflected Mrs. Thane's methodical nature and her deceased husband's modest prosperity. The front parlor contained furniture that had been purchased new rather than acquired secondhand, and the kitchen was equipped with a large coal-burning stove that was the envy of the miners' wives who visited during the early days of Mrs. Thane's widowhood. The root cellar beneath the house was particularly impressive, with stone walls and wooden shelving that could accommodate large quantities of preserved food and household supplies. The miners who gathered for those first Sunday meals in November 1923 remembered Mrs. Thane as an excellent cook, whose skills exceeded those of most women in the community. Her soup was rich and substantial, made with vegetables from her own garden and meat that she claimed to purchase from a farmer named Alistair McPherson, who supposedly operated a small homestead in the next county. The bread was always fresh-baked, still warm when served, and her occasional apple pies were spoken of with genuine appreciation by men who rarely experienced such culinary luxuries. More than 30 people attended that first meal on November 4, 1923, filling the church basement with conversation and laughter that had been rare during the difficult economic period that preceded Mrs. Thane's charitable initiative. Word spread quickly throughout the small community about the widow's kindness, carried by miners who returned to their boarding houses and company cottages with full stomachs and grateful hearts. By the second Sunday, attendance had grown to nearly 50 people, requiring Mrs. Thane to prepare additional quantities of food and recruit volunteers to help serve the meal. The social impact of these gatherings extended far beyond the simple provision of food. The church basement became a focal point for community interaction, a place where miners from different shifts could meet and share information about working conditions, safety concerns, and the various grievances that arose in the dangerous and poorly regulated mining operations of the era. Wives who rarely left their homes found an opportunity to socialize with other women, sharing recipes, discussing household management techniques, and forming the support networks that were essential for survival in isolated mining communities. By December of 1923, the Sunday soup gatherings had become a cornerstone of community life in Beckley Hollow. Families who might otherwise skip church services began attending regularly, drawn not only by the promise of a hot meal, but by the rare opportunity for social gathering during the bleak winter months that stretched from November through March in the mountains of West Virginia. Mrs. Thane seemed to thrive on the activity, arriving early each Sunday to prepare the church basement, setting up the long tables with mismatched chairs and ensuring that everyone felt welcome, regardless of their social standing or financial circumstances. The widow had developed a routine that impressed everyone with its efficiency and attention to detail. She would arrive at the church by 10 o'clock each Sunday morning, 2 hours before the conclusion of services, accompanied by a hired man who helped her transport the large pots of soup and baskets of bread from her house. The hired man, A drifter named Caleb Wickham, who had appeared in the community shortly after Mrs. Thane began her charitable work, was described by witnesses as unusually quiet and deferential, never speaking unless directly addressed, and always referring to Mrs. Thane as the Missus, with a respect that bordered on fear. However, it was during this period that the first subtle oddities began to emerge, though they were initially dismissed as the eccentricities of a grieving widow whose generosity deserved tolerance for minor peculiarities. Several church members noted that Mrs. Thane was peculiarly insistent about certain aspects of the meal service, displaying a level of control that seemed excessive for what was ostensibly a community gathering. She personally ladled every bowl of soup, refusing offers of help from other church ladies who attempted to assist with the serving duties. When the wife of mine foreman Silas Harrington offered to help distribute bread, Mrs. Thane politely but firmly declined, explaining that she preferred to maintain consistency in portion sizes. She also had an unusual habit of watching people eat, standing near the serving table and observing with what some described as an intensity that made them slightly uncomfortable. Mrs. Geneva Caldwell, whose husband Otis worked the dangerous deep shaft operations, later recalled that Mrs. Thane seemed to take particular interest in how much each person consumed and whether they appeared to enjoy the meal. When asked about recipes or cooking methods, she would deflect questions with vague answers about old family secrets and special ingredients that cannot be purchased in any store, responses that only served to heighten the mystery surrounding her exceptional culinary abilities. The winter of 1923-1924 was particularly harsh, with heavy snows that frequently shut down mining operations for days at a time. The coal company's equipment was not well maintained, and freezing temperatures often caused mechanical failures that left miners without work and income for extended periods. During these times of enforced idleness, Mrs. Thane's Sunday meals became even more crucial to community survival, providing not only physical sustenance, but psychological comfort to families facing uncertain economic circumstances. She began preparing larger quantities during this period, sometimes enough to feed 60 or more people, when word-of-mine shutdowns brought additional families seeking assistance. The soup was always hearty and filling, though several regular attendees mentioned in letters and diary entries discovered decades later that it had developed a distinctive taste that was difficult to describe. Some compared it to the metallic tang that sometimes accompanied well water in mining regions where underground operations had affected groundwater quality, while others noted an underlying richness that seemed almost medicinal in its intensity. Ezekiel Carpenter, who was 24 years old during the winter of 1923-1924 and worked as a timber support specialist in the mine's most dangerous sections, kept a brief diary during this period. His entries, discovered in 1967 during the demolition of his childhood boarding house, provide insight into the community's growing dependence on Mrs. Thane's charity. In an entry dated January 15, 1924, Carpenter wrote, "The widow's soup grows more satisfying each week, though I cannot explain why a simple meal should leave me feeling so energized and content." Other men speak of the same experience, a sense of well-being that lasts for days after eating her food. Some joke that she must add whiskey to the pot, but the taste is nothing like alcohol. Whatever her secret, we are fortunate to have such a benefactor during these difficult times. It was during February 1924 that the first disappearances occurred, though the connection to Mrs. Thane's meals would not be established until decades later. The initial vanishing involved Hezekiah Drummond, a bachelor miner in his early 30s, who had arrived in Beckley Hollow the previous autumn, seeking work after losing his position at a mine closure in Pennsylvania. Drummond was known as a reliable worker, despite his tendency towards solitude and his reluctance to form close friendships with his colleagues. He lived in Maudie Fletcher's boarding house, a two-story structure that accommodated 8 single miners in small rooms barely large enough for a bed, washstand, and storage chest. On February 12, 1924, Drummond failed to report for his Monday morning shift at the Mountaineer Mine. His absence was initially attributed to the heavy drinking that sometimes followed particularly difficult work weeks, as Saturday night revelry occasionally extended into Monday morning incapacitation. However, when Drummond had not been seen by the following Sunday, his boarding house landlord, Mrs. Fletcher, contacted Constable Herman Doyle, who served as the community's only law enforcement official. A cursory search of Drummond's room revealed that his few possessions remained untouched, arranged exactly as Mrs. Fletcher remembered them from her weekly cleaning. His work clothes hung neatly on their usual peg. His mining helmet and lamp were stored in their proper place on the small shelf beside his bed, and his mining equipment remained in the common shed behind the boarding house where all residents kept their tools. Most telling was the discovery of a small cache of money hidden in a tobacco tin beneath his mattress. Nearly $40 in bills and coins that represented several weeks' wages and would certainly have been taken if Drummond had planned to leave voluntarily. Constable Doyle's investigation, documented in handwritten reports that were later transferred to the county sheriff's files, revealed that Drummond had been last seen on Sunday evening, February 11th, leaving the church basement after attending the community meal. Several witnesses remembered him commenting favorably on Mrs. Thane's soup and expressing gratitude for her generosity to bachelor miners who rarely enjoyed home-cooked meals. He had appeared to be in normal spirits and had mentioned to another boarder that he looked forward to returning to work Monday morning after a weekend of rest. The constable's report noted that Drummond had been seen walking toward his boarding house around 8:30 Sunday evening, but no witness could confirm his arrival at the building or his presence in his room that night. Mrs. Fletcher, who was known for her strict policies regarding noise and curfews, insisted that she would have heard him enter the building as the front door's hinges squeaked loudly enough to wake anyone sleeping on the first floor. The mystery of Drummond's disappearance deepened when tracks in the snow around the boarding house showed no evidence of anyone approaching or leaving the building between Sunday evening and Monday morning. 3 weeks later, on March 5, 1924, another miner disappeared under circumstances that were eerily similar to Drummond's vanishing. Fergus McCreary, a 40-year-old widower who lived alone in a small cabin near the mine entrance, was discovered missing when he failed to meet his usual carpool arrangement for the Monday morning shift. McCreary had been working at the Mountaineer Mine for 2 years and was known as a dependable employee who had never missed a shift without advance notice. Like Drummond, all of McCreary's possessions remained in place, and there was no indication of struggle or preparation for voluntary departure. His cabin showed no signs of forced entry, his bed appeared to have been slept in, and his breakfast dishes were washed and put away in their usual places. Most puzzling was the discovery that his Sunday clothes were hanging in the wardrobe, indicating that he had changed into work clothes in preparation for Monday's shift, yet he had never appeared at the carpool meeting point. McCreary had also attended the Sunday meal at the church, where several witnesses remembered him praising Mrs. Thane's soup and expressing particular appreciation for the bread, which he said reminded him of his late wife's baking. He had been observed leaving the church basement at approximately 8 o'clock Sunday evening, walking in the direction of his cabin with his characteristic unhurried gait. No one reported seeing him after that point, and his disappearance was not discovered until Monday evening, when his carpool partners finally went to his cabin to investigate his absence. The pattern established by these first 2 disappearances continued throughout the winter and into the spring of 1924, creating a growing sense of unease in the community that was compounded by the inability of local authorities to provide satisfactory explanations. By June, 7 miners had vanished without trace, all of them regular attendees at the Sunday soup gatherings, and all of them men whose social isolation made their disappearances less likely to be immediately noticed. The missing men included Tobias Grenville, a recent immigrant from Scotland who spoke English with a heavy accent that made communication difficult; Asa Whitmore, a former soldier who suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress and preferred solitude to social interaction; Levi Thornfield, an older miner who had lost his family in a typhoid epidemic and lived alone in a cabin he had built himself; Josiah Underhill, a man in his 20s who had been shunned by the community after rumors circulated about his past involvement in labor organizing activities; and Ezra Fitzsimmons, a bachelor who worked the most dangerous shifts because he needed the additional pay to support an elderly mother in Ohio. These men came from different boarding houses and worked different shifts, with seemingly nothing in common beyond their participation in Mrs. Thane's charity and their social isolation within the community. They represented a cross-section of the mining workforce's most vulnerable members, recent arrivals, social outcasts, and men without strong family connections who could advocate for them when they went missing. Reverend Merkel's journal entries from this period reflect his growing concern about the mysterious disappearances and his gradual recognition that a pattern was emerging that defied conventional explanation. In an entry dated May 15, 1924, he wrote, "The loss of so many faithful congregants weighs heavily upon my mind and soul. These were good men, hard-working and decent, with no apparent reason to abandon their lives here without warning or explanation. I have prayed for guidance in this matter, but find myself troubled by thoughts I dare not speak aloud to any member of the congregation." The Reverend's concerns were heightened by his observations of Mrs. Thane's behavior during this period. He noted subtle changes in her demeanor that troubled him, though he struggled to articulate exactly what seemed different about the woman who had become such an important figure in community life. "There is something in the way Mrs. Thane inquires about each missing man," he wrote in a later entry, "as though she seeks confirmation of details she already knows rather than information she hopes to learn. Her questions seem less born of concern than of a need to verify information that she has obtained through means unknown to me." The Reverend also documented changes in Mrs. Thane's physical appearance and energy level. As the disappearances continued, she had become more animated, almost energetic, in contrast to the subdued grief that had characterized her earlier widowhood. Her eyes, which had once seemed distant and mournful, now held what he described as an alertness that borders on anticipation, as though she awaits news that she expects to find satisfying. Most disturbing to the Reverend was her apparent lack of genuine surprise when informed of each new disappearance, responding to the news with what seemed like rehearsed expressions of concern rather than authentic shock or dismay. By summer 1924, the Sunday soup tradition had become a source of nervous tension rather than comfort for many community members. Though few dared to voice their concerns openly for fear of appearing ungrateful to a woman whose generosity had helped them survive the harsh winter months. Attendance began to decline as some families found excuses to leave immediately after church services, claiming urgent household duties or family obligations that prevented them from participating in the communal meal. Mrs. Thane seemed undeterred by the reduced attendance, continuing to prepare large quantities of food even when only a dozen people appeared for the meal. Those who did attend noted that her soup had continued to evolve, developing an increasingly complex flavor profile that some found almost addictive. Regular attendees spoke of craving the weekly meal in ways that seemed to surprise them, counting the days until Sunday and finding that other food seemed bland and unsatisfying by comparison. It was during this period that Silas Harrington, a mine foreman with 15 years of experience and a reputation for level-headed observation, began to document his own suspicions about Mrs. Thane and the community meals. Harrington was 38 years old, married to a woman named Martha, who had been raised in a farming family and possessed practical skills that made her valuable to the community during medical emergencies and domestic crises. The couple lived with Harrington's elderly mother in one of the larger company houses, accommodations that reflected Harrington's supervisory position and his standing within the mining hierarchy. Harrington had initially been grateful for Mrs. Thane's generosity, particularly during the difficult winter months when his supervisory duties often required him to work extended hours that left little time for family life. His wife Martha had praised Mrs. Thane's cooking and had attempted to learn some of her techniques, though the widow consistently deflected requests for recipes or cooking instruction. However, as the disappearances mounted and the pattern became impossible to ignore, Harrington began to notice details that troubled him despite his inability to articulate a specific reason for his discomfort. In a letter to his brother Jacob in Cincinnati, dated July 3, 1924, Harrington documented his observations with the methodical precision that had made him successful as a mine foreman. The letter, discovered in 1958 among Jacob Harrington's papers after his death, provides crucial insight into the community's growing unease during this period. There is something not right about the Thane woman, though I hesitate to voice such suspicions without proof that would satisfy a reasonable man. She watches us eat with the intensity of a hawk observing prey, noting who takes large portions and who seems particularly satisfied with the meal. Last Sunday, I noticed that she serves certain individuals larger portions, always the men who live alone or have few connections in the community. When I mentioned this observation to Martha, my wife pointed out that Mrs. Thane seems to know personal details about the miners that she should have no way of knowing, their work schedules, their financial situations, their family circumstances, or lack thereof. It is as though she has made a study of our lives, cataloging our vulnerabilities, and measuring our value to the community. Humorous. Harrington's letter also described an incident that occurred on June 29, 1924, when he claimed to have seen Mrs. Thane in the early morning hours, well before dawn, walking near the old mine shaft that had been abandoned after a collapse in 1921. The abandoned shaft was located approximately a mile from the active mining operations, in a section of the valley that had been deemed too dangerous for continued excavation due to unstable geological conditions. The area was generally avoided by community members, both because of safety concerns and because of the 5 men who had died in the collapse that led to its closure. According to Harrington's account, he had been returning from an emergency repair call at the mine when he observed a figure moving through the pre-dawn darkness with what appeared to be a heavy burden. The figure was carrying what looked like a large sack over one shoulder and moved with surprising agility despite the apparent weight of the load. When Harrington called out, thinking that someone might be in distress, the figure disappeared into the wood surrounding the abandoned shaft with a speed that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. The next morning, Harrington investigated the area and found evidence of recent activity near the abandoned shaft: disturbed earth, broken vegetation, and what appeared to be drag marks leading to the shaft opening. Most disturbing was his discovery of a small pile of items that seemed to have been dropped or discarded: buttons, a belt buckle, and a pocket watch that he recognized as belonging to one of the missing miners. When he mentioned these discoveries to other miners, several admitted to similar early morning encounters with mysterious figures in the area, though most had dismissed them as products of fatigue or poor visibility in the pre-dawn darkness. Harrington's letter revealed that he had begun to deliberately avoid the Sunday meals, despite his family's financial struggles and his wife's disappointment at missing the social opportunity. I have instructed Martha to politely decline Mrs. Thane's invitations, claiming that my mother's health requires us to return home immediately after services. He wrote, "The truth is that I can no longer stomach the thought of eating food prepared by hands that may be stained with deeds I dare not imagine. The soup's taste has become too rich, too satisfying, and I find myself wondering what ingredients she might be using that she acquires through means other than conventional purchase from legitimate suppliers. The letter concluded with observations that proved to be prophetic. I fear that the disappearances will continue until someone finds the courage to investigate Mrs. Thane more thoroughly than our local constable has thus far managed. The man seems content to treat each vanishing as an isolated incident of voluntary departure, but the pattern is too clear to ignore for anyone willing to examine the evidence objectively. 7 good men do not simply vanish into the air without leaving some trace, unless someone has taken great care to ensure that no trace remains. I pray that I am wrong in my suspicions, but I cannot shake the feeling that we have welcomed a predator into our midst, disguised as a benefactor whose charity masks intentions too horrible to contemplate. Harrington's warnings went unheeded by local authorities, who were already overwhelmed by labor disputes and safety violations at the various mining operations throughout the region. Constable Doyle was a well-meaning man, but his law enforcement experience was limited to minor disputes and occasional drunkenness cases. The complexity of investigating multiple disappearances was beyond his capabilities, and he lacked the resources to conduct the type of thorough investigation that the circumstances demanded. The county sheriff's office was understaffed and relied heavily on company security forces, who were more concerned with preventing worker organization and maintaining production schedules than investigating the disappearance of individual miners. The missing men were noted in official reports, but no comprehensive investigation was launched, and no connections were drawn between their vanishings and the Sunday meal gatherings that represented the only common thread linking the victims. As autumn returned to Beckley Hollow in 1924, Mrs. Thane announced that she would be expanding her charitable efforts to better serve the community's needs during the approaching winter months. In addition to the Sunday soup gatherings, she began offering special meals for miners working double shifts or holiday schedules, claiming that her late husband would have wanted her to do everything possible to support the men who risked their lives in the dangerous underground workings that provided the community's economic foundation. These additional meals were served from her own home, where she could accommodate smaller groups in her large kitchen and parlor, creating a more intimate atmosphere that she claimed would be more comfortable for men who were tired after extended shifts underground. The house offered better facilities than the church basement, with proper heating, comfortable seating, and the ability to serve meals at any hour rather than being restricted to Sunday afternoon schedules. Mrs. Thane's home had always been regarded as one of the finest residences in Beckley Hollow, though few community members had been invited inside before she began hosting the special meals. Those who attended these gatherings found themselves impressed by the quality of the furnishings, the cleanliness of the household, and the obvious prosperity that had allowed the Thanes to accumulate possessions that exceeded the modest means of most mining families. The kitchen was particularly notable for its size and modern appointments, featuring a large coal-burning stove that could accommodate multiple pots simultaneously and extensive storage facilities that allowed Mrs. Thane to maintain supplies adequate for feeding large groups. The pantry contained shelves lined with preserved foods, canned goods, and specialty items that would have been expensive luxuries for most families in the community. The root cellar beneath the kitchen was equally impressive, with stone walls and wooden shelving that could accommodate substantial quantities of stored food and household supplies. The first of these intimate gatherings was held on October 15, 1924, for a group of 5 miners who had volunteered to work the dangerous Sunday shift that was sometimes required during peak demand periods when the coal company received urgent orders from industrial customers. The 5 men, Otis Caldwell, Ezra Fitzsimmons, Levi Thornfield, Asa Whitmore, and Josiah Underhill, were known to be solitary individuals with few family connections, making them ideal candidates for the dangerous and unpopular Sunday shift assignments. They accepted Mrs. Thane's invitation gratefully, looking forward to a home-cooked meal and comfortable environment that would provide respite from their boarding house accommodations before reporting for their overnight shift. The men arrived at Mrs. Thane's house around 6 o'clock Sunday evening after completing their regular shift duties, and were welcomed into her kitchen for what she promised would be her most elaborate meal yet. According to Mrs. Thane's later confession, this gathering represented her most ambitious undertaking to date, as she planned to eliminate 5 victims simultaneously rather than continuing the pattern of individual disappearances that had characterized her previous crimes. The logistics of disposing of 5 bodies would be more challenging, but the reward would be substantial, enough meat to sustain her needs for several months, and sufficient supplies for the increasingly elaborate meals that had become her signature contribution to community life. None of the 5 men reported for their Monday morning shift, an absence that could not be easily dismissed or overlooked given the critical nature of their work assignments. Unlike previous disappearances, which had involved individual minors whose absence might be attributed to voluntary departure or a personal crisis, this mass vanishing could not be explained away as coincidence or individual choice. The mine supervisor was forced to shut down an entire section due to lack of workers, and the financial impact of the production delay prompted company officials to demand a more thorough investigation from county authorities. Sheriff Clayton Bosworth arrived in Beckley Hollow on October 17, 1924, accompanied by 2 deputies and a commitment to resolve the mystery of the missing miners in a manner that would satisfy both the coal company and the growing concerns of community members who had begun to question whether their remote valley might be harboring some unknown danger. Bosworth was an experienced lawman with 20 years of service in various rural counties, and he brought investigative skills that exceeded those of the local constable by a considerable margin. Sheriff Bosworth's investigation, documented in detailed reports preserved in the Raleigh County Archives, began with systematic interviews of community members about the last known activities of the missing men. The sheriff's methodical approach quickly established that every witness confirmed the 5 miners had attended Mrs. Thane's Sunday evening meal, departing her house around 9 o'clock in apparent good health and spirits, according to neighbors who had observed their departure. Mrs. Thane herself was cooperative, but oddly detached during her initial interview, providing factual answers about the evening while showing little emotional response to the men's disappearance. Her account of the evening was suspiciously detailed and precise, as though she had rehearsed her responses in preparation for official questioning. She remembered exactly what each man had eaten, how much he had consumed, and specific comments he had made during the meal, displaying a level of attention to detail that seemed excessive even for a hostess taking pride in her hospitality. When pressed about why she recalled such specific details, Mrs. Thane explained that she took great pride in her cooking and always paid careful attention to her guests' enjoyment of the food, noting their preferences so that she could better accommodate their tastes in future gatherings. Her memory of the conversation topics, however, was notably vague, and she could not recall any mention of the men's plans for Monday or their intentions after leaving her house, claiming that the discussion had focused primarily on appreciation for the meal and general commentary about mining work. The sheriff noted in his report that Mrs. Thane's demeanor during questioning was peculiarly calm for someone whose guests had mysteriously vanished shortly after leaving her home. Most people in similar circumstances would have displayed signs of distress, confusion, or at least heightened concern about the implications of the disappearance. Mrs. Thane, however, answered questions with the detachment of someone discussing routine household matters, showing no indication that she understood the potential seriousness of her situation as the last person known to have seen the missing men alive. A thorough search of Mrs. Thane's property revealed an exceptionally clean and well-organized household that showed evidence of recent and extensive cleaning. The kitchen floors had been scrubbed to an almost sterile condition, with no trace of the food preparation that should have been evident after cooking for 5 guests. The large wood-burning stove had been cleaned inside and out, removing any evidence of the specific foods that had been prepared or the methods used in their preparation. The root cellar beneath the house contained only typical preserved foods and vegetables, though deputies noted an unusual quantity of large cooking pots, serving implements, and food storage containers, far more than would typically be needed for a household of 1 person. When questioned about the extensive cookware collection, Mrs. Thane explained that she had inherited many items from her mother and had acquired additional pieces to support her charitable meal preparation activities. The most significant discovery came when deputies conducted a careful search of the area surrounding Mrs. Thane's property, paying particular attention to any signs of recent disturbance or unusual activity. Behind the house, near an old well that had been sealed years earlier when the main water supply was connected to the community system, they found recently disturbed earth and unmistakable evidence of repeated digging operations. The soil showed signs of lime treatment, a substance commonly used to neutralize odors and accelerate decomposition of organic matter. When questioned about the disturbed ground, Mrs. Thane claimed to have been preparing an expanded vegetable garden and using lime to improve the soil quality for spring planting. However, her explanation was undermined by the fact that the disturbed area was located in a shaded section of her property that would have been unsuitable for vegetable cultivation. Sheriff Bosworth's suspicions were further aroused when he examined the sealed well more closely. The wooden covering showed signs of recent removal and replacement, with fresh tool marks visible on the boards and new nails that had not yet acquired the weathered appearance of the original construction. Most damning was the discovery of personal items scattered around the well site. Buttons of various types and sizes, belt buckles, coins, and a pocket watch that was positively identified as belonging to Fergus McCreary, one of the miners who had disappeared months earlier. When confronted with this evidence, Mrs. Thane's demeanor changed dramatically. The cooperative but distant attitude was replaced by a cold, calculating alertness that suggested a sharp intelligence behind the facade of simple widowhood that she had presented to the community. When Sheriff Bosworth suggested that the well should be opened and examined to determine what might be hidden beneath the sealed covering, she objected strenuously, claiming that disturbing the site would contaminate the groundwater for neighboring properties and create health hazards for the entire community. Her protests became increasingly agitated as the sheriff persisted in his questions about the well and the disturbed soil, and she eventually demanded to speak with a lawyer before answering any additional questions. This response was highly unusual for someone whose innocence should have made cooperation with the investigation natural and appropriate, and it served to heighten the sheriff's suspicions about her possible involvement in the disappearances. The sheriff obtained a court order and arranged for the sealed well to be opened on October 20, 1924, despite Mrs. Thane's continued objections and her attempts to delay the process through legal challenges. The excavation was conducted with the assistance of several experienced miners who volunteered their services, and what they discovered in the depths of the old well defied the expectations of even the most hardened law enforcement officials who had participated in the investigation. The well, which appeared to have been dry and unused for many years, contained a carefully organized collection of human remains that demonstrated a level of methodical planning that was both horrifying and impressive in its efficiency. The bones had been stripped of all soft tissue through a process that suggested considerable skill and experience in butchery techniques, and they had been arranged in neat bundles according to type and size, creating a systematic storage system that maximized the use of available space. Mixed with the carefully organized bones were personal effects that could be matched to the missing minors: pocket watches, wedding rings, coins, work badges, and other small valuables that the victims had carried with them. These items had been sorted and bundled with the same methodical precision as the human remains, suggesting that Mrs. Thane had approached the disposal of her victims with the same organizational skills that had characterized her charitable meal preparation. Most disturbing was the discovery, during a more comprehensive search conducted after the well excavation, of a detailed ledger hidden behind a false wall in Mrs. Thane's root cellar. This ledger contained meticulous records dating back to the beginning of her Sunday soup tradition, documenting not only the names and attendance patterns of meal participants, but their personal habits, living situations, work schedules, financial circumstances, and social connections within the community. Each disappeared minor was noted in the ledger with specific details about their degree of social isolation, their likelihood of being missed if they vanished, and their physical characteristics, including estimated body weight and apparent health condition. The entries read like a livestock inventory, reducing human beings to their utility as sources of meat and their risk level as potential victims whose disappearance might prompt unwanted investigation. The ledger also contained what could only be described as recipes, but not the conventional cooking instructions that might be found in a normal household cookbook. These recipes detailed the preparation of human flesh for consumption, including specific methods for tenderizing meat from different parts of the body, seasoning combinations that would mask the distinctive taste and texture of human flesh, and cooking techniques designed to make the prepared meat indistinguishable from conventional beef or pork. Margin notes throughout the ledger indicated that Mrs. Thane had been conducting systematic experiments with different preparation methods, testing various spice combinations and cooking approaches to determine the most effective ways of disguising human meat for consumption by unsuspecting victims. The level of detail and scientific methodology evident in these notes suggested that she had been developing her techniques over an extended period, possibly years before beginning her activities in Beckley Hollow. Perhaps most horrifying was the revelation that the Sunday soup had indeed contained human meat, carefully prepared and mixed with conventional ingredients in proportions calculated to mask its true nature while providing the rich, satisfying flavor that had made Mrs. Thane's cooking so popular among community members. The miners who had praised her soup and found themselves craving her meals had been consuming the flesh of their missing colleagues, participating in an act of cannibalism that violated the most fundamental taboos of civilized society. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence discovered during the investigation, Mrs. Thane initially maintained her innocence, claiming that she had discovered some of the remains in the old well and had been afraid to report them due to fear of being blamed for crimes she had not committed. She suggested that someone else must have been using her property to dispose of victims, possibly during her absences from home or while she slept. However, as additional evidence emerged from the detailed analysis of her ledger and the systematic examination of the human remains, her story began to collapse under the weight of contradictory details and impossible explanations. The level of organization evident in the disposal methods, the careful documentation of victim selection criteria, and the sophisticated knowledge of butchery and food preparation techniques all pointed to someone with extensive experience and methodical planning capabilities. Eventually, faced with forensic evidence that could not be explained by her claims of innocence, Mrs. Thane confessed to the systematic murder of 12 miners over the course of nearly a year, along with the murder of her husband Ambrose 2 years earlier. Her confession, given to Sheriff Bosworth and a court stenographer on October 22, 1924, revealed the calculated nature of her crimes and provided insight into a mind that had developed a system of murder and cannibalism with the same methodical precision that most people applied to household management. Mrs. Thane's confession revealed that she had been selecting victims based on carefully developed criteria that minimize the risk of detection while maximizing the utility of each murder. She preferred men who lived alone, had few close friends, and maintained irregular schedules that would delay the discovery of their absence. She also favored individuals who were new to the community or who had limited social connections, as their disappearance was less likely to prompt immediate concern or thorough investigation. The actual murders were accomplished through a sophisticated poisoning system that Mrs. Thane had developed through experimentation with various toxic substances available in the rural environment. She used a combination of arsenic, which she extracted from rat poison, and certain industrial chemicals available at the mining operations, and plant-based toxins that she derived from several species of poisonous mushrooms and plants that grew wild in the mountainous region surrounding Beckley Hollow. The poison was administered through special portions of food that were prepared separately from the meal served to other guests, ensuring that only the intended victims were affected while maintaining the appearance of normal hospitality. The toxin combination caused paralysis before death, ensuring that victims could not struggle, call for help, or attempt to escape once the effects began to manifest. Death typically occurred within 2 to 4 hours, during which time Mrs. Thane would maintain conversation with her victims, sometimes expressing false concern about their apparent illness while preventing them from seeking medical assistance. After the murders, Mrs. Thane would dismember the bodies in her cellar using techniques she claimed to have learned during her childhood, when her father supplemented his mining income by working part-time as a butcher in their previous community. She possessed considerable skill in separating different cuts of meat and had developed efficient methods for processing human flesh that maximized the usable portions while minimizing waste. The bones and other remains that could not be used for food preparation were disposed of in the sealed well, which she had modified to serve as a storage facility for evidence disposal. She had installed a pulley system that allowed her to lower bundles of remains into the well depths without difficulty, and she used lime treatments to control odors and accelerate decomposition of any organic matter that might create detection risks. The usable flesh was preserved through a combination of smoking, salting, and cold storage techniques that allowed her to maintain supplies for extended periods. She had converted a section of her root cellar into a specialized preservation facility, complete with hanging systems for cured meat and storage containers for processed portions that were ready for cooking. Mrs. Thane's confession also revealed the psychological motivations behind her crimes, which she described in terms that suggested significant mental disturbance combined with a calculating intelligence that had enabled her to maintain her criminal activities for an extended period. She claimed that consuming human flesh had restored her vitality after her husband's death, making her feel young, strong, and energetic in ways that conventional food could not provide. She believed that sharing this special food with the community was a form of communion that created bonds between people that transcended normal human relationships. The act of feeding community members the flesh of their neighbors gave her a sense of power and control that she described as intoxicating, allowing her to manipulate and dominate people who remained unaware of their participation in her cannibalistic activities. The confession revealed that Mrs. Thane had also murdered her husband Ambrose, contradicting the official records that attributed his death to a mining accident. She admitted to poisoning him after becoming obsessed with the idea of consuming human flesh, which she said had been inspired by stories she had read about frontier cannibalism during periods of starvation and survival in harsh wilderness conditions. Ambrose's murder had been her first experiment in human butchery and flesh preservation, and his body had provided her with both the meat she craved and the opportunity to develop the techniques she would later use on subsequent victims. She had staged the mining accident that officially caused his death, using her knowledge of the dangerous working conditions to create a plausible explanation for his demise, while concealing her role in his murder. The trial of Cordelia Thane began on January 15, 1925, in the Raleigh County Courthouse, attracting national attention from newspapers and magazines that sensationalized the case as one of the most shocking crimes in American history. Reporters from major cities traveled to West Virginia to cover what they termed the cannibal widow of Beckley Hollow, auditory, and the courtroom was packed with spectators who had traveled considerable distances to witness the proceedings. The evidence presented during the trial was overwhelming and gruesome, including detailed testimony about the contents of Mrs. Thane's ledger, physical evidence recovered from the well and her property, and expert testimony about the methods used to prepare human flesh for consumption. The prosecution methodically demonstrated that Mrs. Thane had committed a series of premeditated murders motivated by her cannibalistic compulsions and her desire to exert psychological control over her unsuspecting community. Testimony from surviving community members who had unknowingly consumed human flesh at the Sunday soup gatherings provided some of the most emotionally devastating moments of the trial. Many witnesses broke down while describing their realization that they had been participants in cannibalistic activities, and several required medical attention due to the psychological trauma of learning the truth about meals they had enjoyed and appreciated. The defense attempted to argue that Mrs. Thane was mentally incompetent due to grief-induced madness following her husband's death, suggesting that her crimes were the result of psychological breakdown rather than calculated criminal behavior. However, the meticulous planning evident in her victim selection process, the sophisticated methods she had developed for murder and body disposal, and the systematic documentation in her ledger all undermined claims of insanity or mental incompetence. The prosecution successfully argued that Mrs. Thane's crimes represented a level of premeditation, organization, and methodical execution that demonstrated clear criminal responsibility and rational decision-making capacity. The systematic nature of her activities over an extended period, combined with her ability to maintain a facade of normal behavior while interacting with community members, indicated that she possessed the mental faculties necessary to understand the nature and consequences of her actions. On February 8, 1925, after hearing 3 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 12 counts of first-degree murder. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clear demonstration of Mrs. Thane's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Mrs. Thane was sentenced to death by electrocution, becoming one of the first women in West Virginia to receive capital punishment for multiple murder convictions. The judge, in pronouncing the sentence, described her crimes as acts of such calculated evil and systematic depravity that they shock the conscience of civilized society and demand the ultimate penalty available under law. However, Mrs. Thane never faced execution for her crimes. On March 3, 1925, while awaiting transfer to the state penitentiary where her sentence was to be carried out, she was found dead in her jail cell, having apparently consumed a concentrated poison that she had somehow concealed somewhere on her person, despite thorough searches conducted when she was first incarcerated. A brief note left beside her body stated simply, "The recipe dies with me," suggesting that she had taken pride in her culinary techniques for preparing human flesh and was determined to prevent anyone else from duplicating her methods. The note was written in the same precise handwriting that had characterized her victim ledger, displaying a calm control that seemed inconsistent with someone facing imminent execution. The aftermath of the Thane case devastated the small community of Beckley Hollow, creating psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate families of the murder victims. Many residents who had attended the Sunday soup gatherings suffered severe emotional distress upon learning that they had unknowingly consumed human flesh, and several families left the area entirely, unable to cope with the knowledge of their unwitting participation in cannibalistic activities. The psychological impact was particularly severe for community members who had praised Mrs. Thane's cooking and looked forward to her weekly meals. The realization that their enjoyment of the food had been based on its preparation from human flesh created a form of trauma that many found impossible to overcome. Several individuals developed severe eating disorders and required medical treatment for malnutrition as they became unable to consume meat of any kind. The church where the meals had been served was abandoned shortly after the trial concluded, as congregation members found themselves unable to worship in a space so strongly associated with the horrific crimes. The building stood empty for several years before being torn down in 1928, with the lumber burned rather than reused due to superstitions about the contamination of materials associated with cannibalistic activities. Reverend Merkel, deeply traumatized by his unwitting role in facilitating Mrs. Thane's crimes, suffered what his family described as a complete nervous breakdown that required extended hospitalization and medical treatment. He resigned his ministerial position and left West Virginia permanently, never again serving in any religious capacity. His final journal entry, written shortly before his departure from Beckley Hollow, expressed his profound guilt over having enabled what he termed the most evil deception ever perpetrated under the guise of Christian charity. The mining company that employed most of the community's residents decided to close the Beckley Hollow operation in late 1925, citing both the psychological impact on the remaining workforce and the negative publicity generated by the case. The company's executives determined that the association with the cannibalistic murders would make it impossible to recruit replacement workers or maintain productive operations in the location. As the mining operation shut down, the economic foundation of the community disappeared, forcing most remaining residents to seek employment elsewhere. The town itself gradually became a deserted settlement as families moved away and new residents refused to relocate to an area so strongly associated with notorious crimes. By 1930, only a handful of families remained in the valley, and the last permanent residents had departed by 1940. The abandoned community became the subject of academic study as researchers attempted to understand how such systematic crimes could occur in a small, supposedly close-knit community without detection for such an extended period. Dr. Miranda Ashworth, a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins University, conducted extensive research on the case during the 1940s as part of her pioneering work in criminal psychology and the social dynamics of cannibalism. Dr. Ashworth's analysis, published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1948, identified several critical factors that had enabled Mrs. Thane's crimes to continue undetected for nearly a year. The isolation of the mining community, the transient nature of much of the workforce, and the desperate economic conditions that made residents dependent on charity all contributed to an environment where missing individuals might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. The researcher also noted the sophisticated psychological manipulation involved in Mrs. Thane's methods, particularly her exploitation of community trust and her use of religious charity as cover for criminal activities. The psychiatrist theorized that Mrs. Thane derived satisfaction not only from the physical act of murder and cannibalism, but from the psychological control she exercised over her victims and the entire community. Dr. Ashworth's research included extensive interviews with surviving community members, many of whom continued to suffer significant psychological effects decades after the crimes were discovered. Common symptoms among survivors included persistent nausea when attempting to eat meat, severe anxiety surrounding food preparation and consumption, recurring nightmares about cannibalism, and social withdrawal that reflected their inability to trust others after being so completely deceived. The doctor's investigation also revealed that Mrs. Thane's crimes had likely been far more extensive than originally established during the official investigation. Through careful analysis of missing person reports from surrounding counties and examination of records from other mining communities throughout the region, Dr. Ashworth discovered evidence suggesting that similar disappearances had occurred in multiple locations where the Thanes had previously lived. This pattern suggested that Mrs. Thane's cannibalistic practices may have begun years before her arrival in Beckley Hollow, and that the total number of victims could have exceeded the 12 confirmed cases by a significant margin. The frequent relocations that had characterized the Thanes' marriage took on a sinister significance when viewed in light of the systematic nature of the crimes and the careful victim selection methods documented in Mrs. Thane's ledger. Dr. Ashworth's research revealed that Ambrose and Cordelia Thane had lived in mining communities throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio during their marriage, never remaining in any single location for more than 3 or 4 years. Each relocation seemed to coincide with unexplained disappearances of local residents who fit the same profile as Mrs. Thane's later confirmed victims, isolated men with few social connections who were unlikely to be immediately missed. The psychiatrist's investigation uncovered records of missing persons in at least 6 previous communities where the Thanes had resided, with disappearance patterns that closely matched the systematic approach later documented in Beckley Hollow. In each case, the missing individuals were men who lived alone, worked dangerous jobs, and had limited family or social connections that might prompt thorough investigation of their absence. Dr. Ashworth's final report, submitted to law enforcement agencies in multiple states in 1948, estimated that Mrs. Thane may have been responsible for as many as 50 murders over the course of 2 decades of marriage and widowhood. The report recommended that cold cases in former Thane residences be reopened and investigated for possible connections to her documented crimes, though the passage of time and destruction of many records made such investigations largely impractical. The Thane house itself became the subject of local folklore and superstition following the conclusion of the legal proceedings. Although the property was eventually sold to a lumber company and the structure demolished in 1932, local residents reported strange occurrences at the site for many years afterward. People claimed to detect cooking odors emanating from the empty lot, particularly on Sunday evenings, and some reported seeing lights in windows of a house that no longer existed. These accounts were generally dismissed by authorities as products of collective trauma and psychological suggestion, but they persisted well into the 1950s and contributed to the site's reputation as a place to be avoided. The lot remained vacant for decades, as potential buyers were deterred by the property's association with the cannibalistic murders and the persistent local belief that the location was somehow contaminated by the crimes that had occurred there. In 1965, during construction of a new highway through the former Beckley Hollow area, road crews made a disturbing discovery that confirmed Dr. Ashworth's suspicions about the true extent of Mrs. Thane's crimes. Excavation work uncovered additional human remains buried throughout the valley, scattered in multiple locations that suggested a systematic body disposal operation far more extensive than the single well that had been discovered during the original investigation. The bones were fragmentary and incomplete, indicating that Mrs. Thane had disposed of body parts in numerous locations rather than concentrating all evidence in a single site. Forensic examination of the remains suggested that some dated back 15 or more years, supporting the theory that her criminal activities had begun much earlier than the official investigation had determined and had continued over a much longer period than originally believed. The discovery of these additional remains prompted a renewed investigation by the West Virginia State Police, though the passage of 4 decades had made identification of victims nearly impossible. Most records from the era had been lost or destroyed, and virtually no witnesses remained alive who could provide useful information about the earlier disappearances or the Thanes' activities in previous communities. The renewed investigation was eventually closed without additional prosecutions, leaving many questions about the full extent of Mrs. Thanes' crimes permanently unanswered. However, the discovery confirmed that the Beckley Hollow case represented only the final chapter in a much longer career of systematic murder and cannibalism that may have claimed dozens of additional victims across multiple states and communities. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case was the recognition that Mrs. Thanes' system had been nearly perfect in its conception and execution. Her careful selection of isolated victims, her sophisticated disposal methods, and her exploitation of community desperation to provide cover for her activities had created a sustainable pattern of murder that might have continued indefinitely under different circumstances. The efficiency and organization of her operation contradicted common assumptions about the psychological profiles of individuals who commit extreme crimes, demonstrating that such acts could be perpetrated by someone who appeared completely normal and even admirable to those around them. Mrs. Thanes' success in maintaining her facade of charitable widowhood while systematically murdering and consuming members of her community challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior and social dynamics. The case files preserved in the West Virginia State Archives include extensive testimony from minors and community members who survived Mrs. Thanes' period of activity, providing insight into how a community could unknowingly harbor such a dangerous predator. Their accounts reveal a population living under the influence of systematic deception, accepting unusual circumstances as normal due to their economic vulnerability and social isolation. Many survivors expressed profound guilt about their unknowing participation in cannibalistic activities, feelings that persisted for the remainder of their lives and affected their ability to form normal social relationships or trust other people. The psychological trauma extended to subsequent generations, as children and grandchildren of survivors inherited stories about the community's collective victimization and the horrific nature of their ancestors' experiences. The last known survivor of the original Beckley Hollow community was Ezekiel Carpenter, who lived until 1983 and frequently cooperated with historians and researchers studying the case. Carpenter, who had been a young miner during Mrs. Thanes' period of activity, provided valuable first-hand accounts of the atmosphere of growing fear that had settled over the community as the disappearances mounted, though he emphasized that no one understood the true source of the danger they faced. Carpenter described Mrs. Thanes as a woman who seemed to possess an uncanny knowledge about people's private lives and circumstances, as though she made it her business to study everyone around her for purposes that were never clear at the time. He recalled feeling increasingly uncomfortable in her presence despite her apparent kindness and generosity, sensing something predatory in her attention that he could not articulate until long after her crimes were discovered. In his final interview, recorded by the West Virginia Historical Society in 1982, Carpenter reflected on the lasting psychological impact of learning the truth about the Sunday soup gatherings and his own participation in unknowing cannibalism. He described the moment of realization as a kind of sickness that settled into my bones and never entirely left. A knowledge that changed everything I thought I understood about human nature and the possibility of evil hiding behind masks of goodness. Carpenter became a vegetarian immediately after Mrs. Thanes' arrest and never again consumed soup of any kind, finding himself unable to tolerate foods that reminded him of the meals he had enjoyed so much during that terrible winter. He described the psychological torment of realizing that his grateful appreciation for Mrs. Thanes' cooking had actually been appreciation for her skill at preparing human flesh for consumption by an unsuspecting community. The Beckley Hollow case became a standard subject of study in criminal psychology programs and continued to be cited in research on serial killing, cannibalism, and the social factors that enable such crimes to flourish undetected. The combination of social isolation, economic desperation, and exploitation of community trust created what modern criminologists term a perfect storm of circumstances that allowed Mrs. Thane's systematic murders to continue for an extended period. Contemporary forensic analysis of the case suggests that Mrs. Thane's success was also partly attributable to the limited law enforcement resources and investigative techniques available in rural areas during the 1920s. The lack of communication between different jurisdictions meant that patterns of disappearances across multiple communities were never connected, and the absence of modern forensic methods made it difficult to identify human remains or trace evidence to specific suspects. Today, the area where Beckley Hollow once stood is largely uninhabited wilderness, reclaimed by the forest that once surrounded the mining community. The valley has returned to its natural state, with few visible traces of the settlement that once housed several hundred residents and witnessed some of the most disturbing crimes in American criminal history. A small historical marker erected by the state of West Virginia in 1975 acknowledges the former mining settlement and its role in the region's industrial development, though the marker makes no specific mention of Mrs. Thane or the cannibalistic murders that brought the community to national attention. Local hiking trails occasionally bring visitors through the area, though most remain unaware of the dark history that unfolded in these quiet mountains. The sealed well where the original victims' remains were discovered has never been reopened following the conclusion of the official investigation. After forensic examination was completed, the site was filled with concrete and left as an unmarked grave for those victims who could not be identified or claimed by surviving family members. The location serves as a silent monument to the victims of one of America's most systematic cases of serial murder and cannibalism. The case of Cordelia Thane stands as a permanent reminder that evil can assume the appearance of charity and that the most trusted members of a community may conceal the darkest possible intentions. Her Sunday soup gatherings, initially celebrated as acts of Christian kindness and generosity, proved to be elaborate deceptions designed to satisfy cannibalistic appetites, while exerting psychological control over an entire community. The miners who praised her cooking and eagerly anticipated her weekly meals had unknowingly become participants in ritualistic cannibalism that violated the most fundamental taboos of civilized society, consuming the flesh of their missing colleagues while expressing gratitude to the woman who had murdered and butchered those very men. The horrific irony of the situation demonstrates how completely a skilled predator can manipulate and deceive even close-knit communities when circumstances provide adequate cover for criminal activities. In the decades since Mrs. Thane's crimes were discovered, investigators, psychologists, and criminologists have continued to study the case in attempts to understand how such extensive murders could occur within a small community without detection until the final, fatal mistake that exposed the entire operation. The answer appears to lie in the intersection of desperate economic circumstances, social isolation, and the systematic exploitation of trust and vulnerability that characterized life in remote mining communities during the early 20th century. Mrs. Thane possessed an intuitive understanding of these social dynamics and manipulated them with calculated precision, using the community's own hunger and desperation as psychological weapons against them. She recognized that people facing genuine hardship would be unlikely to question the motives behind charitable assistance, especially when that assistance was provided through religious channels that carried implicit moral authority. The final tragedy of the case is that Mrs. Thane's recipe for preparing human flesh did indeed die with her, as she had promised in her suicide note. Despite extensive forensic investigation and chemical analysis of preserved food samples, experts were never able to determine exactly how she had disguised the taste and texture of human meat so effectively that experienced miners accepted it as conventional beef or pork. Her secret techniques for preparing human flesh in palatable form remained hidden, perhaps representing knowledge that died with her in the jail cell where she consumed her final poison. This inability to fully understand her methods serves as a lasting reminder that some forms of evil transcend scientific analysis and rational comprehension, existing in psychological territories that resist complete explanation or understanding. The community that once gathered eagerly for Sunday soup in the Beckley Hollow Church basement was forever scattered by the revelation of what they had unknowingly consumed. Those who survived carried the terrible knowledge like an internal poison, a truth too horrific to fully accept, yet impossible to deny or forget. They had learned that apparent kindness could mask the most monstrous intentions, that charity could serve as cover for unthinkable crimes, and that the most satisfying meals could exact a psychological price that would never be fully paid. The memory of Cordelia Thane continues to serve as a warning from the past, a reminder that beneath the surface of apparently civilized society lurks the constant potential for unimaginable evil. Her Sunday soup tradition, which began as what appeared to be an act of Christian charity during a harsh winter, revealed itself as something far more sinister, a feeding ritual that sustained a human predator while binding her victims together in the most grotesque form of communion conceivable. The widow's pot was indeed free to all who came seeking nourishment, but every bowl served came with a price that those who paid it would never fully comprehend. The true cost of Mrs. Thane's charity was measured not in money, but in the psychological destruction of an entire community, and the violation of fundamental human taboos that separate civilized society from primitive barbarism. As the historical record shows, some stories transcend their immediate circumstances to become cautionary tales about the darker possibilities of human nature. The case of Cordelia Thane represents such a story, demonstrating how systematic evil can flourish when social conditions create vulnerability, and when trust becomes a weapon in the hands of those who would exploit it for unthinkable purposes.